Okay, so let's get started because I'm well known for going off on tangents. So we'll make sure we stay on track because we've got a lot to cover. And what we're presenting on tonight or thinking about tonight is cultural artisan skills and how they can apply in your work in family daycare. I think they have huge potential and they're certainly an underutilized form of the arts that has really resonated with me over my decades in the early childhood profession. But before we get going with the content, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we meet today from all over Australia, this incredible diverse nation that we live in, where we can see the coast, the desert, the river, the mountains, the rainforests, the flatlands, and the sky. And we think about the diversity of our people from so many nations of the earth, but acknowledging our First Nations people, child, adult, elder, all that is, all that has, and all that gives life. And I particularly pay my respects to elders past, present, and those children of the future that we're working for, and extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us in this webinar today. So, as we said, we're presenting on this notion of cultural artisan skills and how they can really empower your visual arts practice throughout your curriculum, throughout the experiences you offer in the family daycare setting. But for those of you who perhaps haven't come across my work before, I worked for 22 years as an early childhood teacher and centre director here in New South Wales predominantly, but a little bit in Western Australia as well. My husband was in the Navy, so that's why we're on the south coast of New South Wales, not far from Albatross Fleet Air Arm. And so for that 22 years, I was very inspired to think deeply about visual arts practice. And I often wondered why so many educators lacked the confidence around the arts, that our schooling system seemed to take away confidence rather than build it for those of us who work with young children. And so that's what led me into doing a PhD on the topic, really exploring the beliefs of early childhood educators around their visual arts practice. I've really enjoyed the last 15 years teaching in the university sector, but have recently decided not to move away from academia and back into working directly with educators in the sector to directly build skills and confidence for the visual arts. And as we're thinking about tonight, for those cultural artisan qualities around the arts. Other projects that bring me a lot of joy, and those of you who follow my Facebook page will have seen that I was sharing some information about an opportunity to go to Nepal later this year. I've just come back from Vietnam, and taking educators into those different cultural contexts is a real joy for me. I've been working with both countries for quite some time now, and so I have lots of connections that can really enrich that intercultural growth and development when we put ourselves into a less comfortable space to think about our own practice. But you can link with a bit of that about me later on. When we farewell each other, I'll give you a QR code if you'd like to stay in touch. So what are we covering tonight? Well, essentially, I'm going to compare the difference between open-ended learning experiences versus close-ended ones. There are a spectrum of options in the arts, and that range of possibilities can actually be really confusing for people. And sometimes, because of that lack of confidence that I talked about earlier, coupled with the confusion about what's okay, what's not okay to do in the arts, I would say that there's nothing that's not okay, but I'd like us to think deeply about how we offer the arts to children to make sure that children's voices are being honoured, lifted up and respected at all times. We'll think about the benefits of the art for children, but also the benefits for the adult play partners, for the educators, the family daycare educators, the early childhood teachers, etc. And then we'll think about how we can really determine the difference between a craft in inverted commas, I say that because the word craft can actually confuse a lot of people. And so we want to be able to tell the difference between predetermined crafts or those adult directed and controlled activities that produce a set outcome versus those that are artisan and traditional crafting that does and can potentially honour the child. So we want to make sure that we can make that distinction about what honours children and what potentially limits children. We also want to think about some practical approaches for your everyday curriculum about how to utilise these artisan traditions to respect children's agency and to highlight those traditional artisan methods in your practice that can really enrich and extend what you offer to children, to add complexity, to add depth, to really be involved as a co-learner, a co-researcher, a co-player with children to keep alive the traditional arts and artisan processes. So Family Daycare team will have sent you a survey, and thanks to those of you who responded. It was really helpful for me also to see your responses as we lead into this training. So you were asked what interests you most about using traditional crafts with children. And a lot of you responded that that idea of exploring cultural traditions was a really positive point, and it certainly is an opportunity. You were also thinking about building children's skills and focus to add variety to the curriculum. And then some of you just weren't quite sure, perhaps curious about what I'm actually going to be talking about. So let's think about that as we have a look at how often you currently use traditional crafts. So things like stitching, weaving, paper crafts and woodwork in your program. And this was probably the one I found most interesting in light of my research focus. So a lot of you said regularly, which is really exciting, but a large majority of you said sometimes, and that's okay too, so long as it's happening sometimes, that's a good thing. There were not many of you who said rarely, and that's really encouraging. Sorry, the rarely was the 5%, the 12%, and then there were some who said not at all, just a small portion of you, 3%, I think that little tiny wedge says. And so that was really interesting to me that overall we're seeing some of those traditional artisan processes in your practice. It'll be interesting to hear from you toward the end of the session whether what I present is what you expected in terms of how we talk about those traditional crafting processes. But what most of you said you wanted to gain from this webinar is the practical, of course, those practical ideas you can use straight away. And hopefully I use a lot of images in my presentations. So hopefully the images alone are going to give you inspiration, but hopefully coupled with the things I say, it will also give many of you food for thought to really reflect upon your choices. And then 37% of you said you would like to make sure you're connecting those crafts to children's interests. And I'd also suggest perhaps some of you were thinking about how to make sure they align with children's capabilities and developmental capacities. Some of you asked, 8% of you asked for strategies around involving families and community. I haven't put a huge amount of emphasis in this presentation, although I will say that there is huge potential to utilise the expertise within our community for some of these traditional knowledges that are potentially disappearing from children's lives because the adults in their lives are not necessarily engaged in the artisan processes the way people were even 10, 20, 30 years ago. And then an equal number of you were just keen to be introduced to the notion of artisan crafts. So I think we have a really nice mix of people who are confident, but also some people who still have a lot of questions, perhaps. So when we're thinking about the difference between open-ended and close-ended experience, I guess I equate that to sort of asking questions where we don't know the answer compared to those close-ended questions that are just a yes/no response, where the outcome is already predetermined, where we're kind of teaching the question as a test that children will know the answer to and prove their knowledge or not. But if you look at the images on the screen, you see a range of arts and crafts on that screen. Some of them an artisan process, like playing with paper, with weaving, with clay. And then those more activity-based arts, the experiential play with paint is certainly a very relevant arts experience. But then we've also got the really structured things, the things where an adult would use a child as a human stamp pad to make a gift for families, where the eyes are positioned by the adult, the horns are added by the adult, even the positioning of the child's foot is controlled by the adult. And then we have sort of open-ended but semi-structured things like bubble printing. So there's a whole heap of other options I could have put on the screen. That's just a very small reflection. But essentially, in my research, I found that there is a lot of pedagogical confusion around the difference between process and product. A lot of people recall that their training taught them that it's the process, not the product, whereas my work and research is suggesting that unless we pay attention to the product, then we're not necessarily reflecting on what the product can tell us about the value of the process that children have been involved in, or how active the child's agency and voice were in that process. We learn that from looking at the product. So I can look at any of the products on this screen and know how involved a child was or wasn't in the creation of the end product. We need to think about that question of whether it's adult or child-centered pedagogy and practice, and whether the educator should support children in the process or not. Many of us in our training, thankfully I wasn't taught this, but I hear from colleagues that many people are told not to interfere, not to engage in arts processes alongside children, not to demonstrate skills or knowledge. And I just think that's an absolute tragedy, because we wouldn't abdicate demonstration and modelling when it comes to teaching children to learn to write their name. So why would we avoid modelling for a skill that has, for a visual language skill? So we need to really reflect on that. And as part of my research, I came up with this notion of a continuum of visual arts experiences to really think about the quality of what we're offering to children. And in my case, I was drawing upon the work of John Dewey, who talked about the kinds of limiting experiences. He called them stagnation experiences. I called them limiting, and they're the little e experiences. So they're still learning experiences, because children learn no matter what the adults in their lives do. They are learning machines. But if the adults are only offering them close-ended, product-driven activities with low-quality materials, or limiting processes where every step in the process has to be directed by the adult, or where the adult has made a template for the children to copy with the predetermined outcome. I put colouring in and stencils in this end of the continuum, even though I acknowledge that there are ways to do colouring in that are more open-ended. But where that non-intervention mantra is very powerful, where people feel that if they involve themselves in children's creative processes, they will, as one of my participants said, corrupt the children's natural creativity. I think that's a huge burden to put on yourself, thinking that your skills and knowledge would corrupt a child's development. So that's something I would like to really challenge. And I also really want to challenge that idea of just putting materials on a table and walking away, as if the materials in and of themselves can invite the child into the full experience of the learning that's possible with those materials. I would say that the adult engagement is the most important ingredient to really elevate what is an activity with materials into a growth-focused learning experience. So we're thinking about the big E growth experiences that John Dewey talked about as consummatory experiences, experiences that consume your delight and your passion and that lead to learning and growth. And if we look back at the little E end, I forgot to add that when we work that way, our focus philosophically will be more focused on entertaining children and keeping them busy, and perhaps making gifts for families, where the adult voice, interest, and control are dominant. Whereas at the big E end of this of the continuum, we're thinking about a focus on education, firstly, and we're thinking about a philosophy that focuses on the child's voice, in their interests, their agency as being central to our thinking. And as you'll see, and I didn't neglect what is really the bread and butter of early education, we need to also value those sensory, exploratory, and experimental play with materials, with art processes and materials and techniques, and providing children with many, many, many repeated experiences with materials and methods in order to support them to build the vocabulary of the visual arts languages. And you will see that the focus of today's workshop is sitting in the middle of that continuum because it sort of straddles the divide. It can be a consummatory growth experience where the child's voice, interest, and agency are centralised, but it also does have that step-by-step skills development, intentional skills development, the direct teaching of techniques, but not necessarily a template to copy. And so I'll unpack that as we move through the slides tonight. But I'd like you to reflect and maybe even jot something down on the notebook that you hopefully have with you. Where is your practice currently located on the continuum? What kinds of arts and crafts are routinely planned and offered in your work with children? Not just what you might do now and then, but what is a regular learning experience around the arts and the crafts for the children in your care? And is that passion to keep children's voices and agency central that you implement most of the time? Can that sometimes be hijacked and plummet down to the little e limiting experiences when it comes time to Christmas, Easter, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Anzac Day, all the days that some people are really obsessed about planning around those calendar dates, which I'd also like to challenge because it can really hijack what children are actually showing an interest in. But that's a whole other webinar, I think. Okay, so let's think about those adult-centric little e experiences. Dewey suggests we need to go way beyond the basic sensory experiences if we are hoping for growth and learning to occur, for those big E experiences to be honoured. He even says that it's a bit like shallow repetition around sort of junk food type activities, experiences with that little e. They're designed to just keep children busy and entertained. They're often close-ended. They're often predetermined. The children are often guided to make something that the adult is really instructing and directing. And sadly, where the adult often does a lot of preparation work, a lot of extra cutting before the children can even start their work. But it's also interesting to note that in the Guide to the National Quality Framework, in element 1.2.3, we are around the topic of child-directed learning. The Guide to the NQF suggests that we must use open-ended resources and materials that allow children to express themselves rather than using templates, stencils, or resources that limit children's capacity to create, to experiment, to interpret, to explore. And around the language in that element, I actually would also like to challenge the very framework's use of allowing children to express themselves. That word allow is problematic for me. I would rather the authors had said something like materials that afford children the opportunity to express themselves. Because as soon as we put the word allow in there, we are positioning the adult as the person who has the power and the control over the agency and the choices of children. So that's just another little prickle point I'd like to throw in there. Thank you to all of you who are putting little comments in the chat. Unfortunately, I can't track them as we speak. So if you do have particular questions you would like to discuss, I'll try and make sure we get through things so there's time for some discussion in the last 10 to 15 minutes. Jot them down now so that you can pop them into the chat toward the end of the webinar. Also, yeah, I don't know how family daycare work this in terms of do you unmute and speak? I'm not sure. I don't think so. So it'd be a case of typing into the chat, I think. But as we think about child-led growth experiences, those big E experiences that build on children's prior knowledge and experience, and we're progressing them to that state of growth and learning. And Dewey suggests that for growth to occur, experiences must build on children's prior knowledge and experience. So it's about us knowing the children that we're working with. And then we're developing skills whereby we can support children to extend their thinking, to build their skills, to really utilize the arts as a visual language, as a poetic language, as they call it in Reggio Emilia, or a graphic language. So they don't talk about art, they talk about the visual languages or the 100 languages of children, where we're involved in processes of inquiry and problem solving, where the curriculum is offered in a very holistic way. So that, for example, as you see on the screen, that beautiful image from my colleague Pete Morehouse in the UK, where we are actually in the process of an artisan process, such as carpentry skills, we're also employing mathematics, language. We might be singing songs about the hammer, 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 tap, tap, tap. We might be counting. We might be measuring. So there's a whole lot of cross-curricular learning that happens when we elevate quality arts processes right across the curriculum. And so if we're thinking about having a value for the arts as a language, Gandini in Reggio Emilia reminds us that the very reason Malaguzzi centered the arts in their curriculum, which, by the way, he actually got that idea from John Dewey, who wrote about laboratories for learning 80 years before the beginning of the Reggio Emilia approach. But in post-World War II Italy, post-fascist Italy, and we've got fascism that we're dealing with around the world right now. So that need for oops, sorry, that must have been on a timer. I'll jump back there. Apologies for that. So one of the central tenets of the Reggio Emilia approach that has guided and continues to drive the Italian educators' work is the idea that every child is a creative child, full of potential, with the desire and the right, the human right, to make meaning out of life within that context of rich relationships with people, materials, and within the environment in many ways, and using many, many languages. And that notion of the 100 languages was born out of the intention to give children their democratic right to education and their democratic right to have their voices heard, honoured, and respected as citizens within their communities. And so that notion of arts engagement as a human right, we need to remember that human rights are lifelong. We need to support and respect children's potential. We need to support them to be visible in their communities, for their voices to be heard, for their participation to be active rather than passive consumers of culture, but to be the creators of culture for their generation, and to develop their capacity to share their ideas using multiple intelligences and languages. And there are several human rights that speak to this, but probably one of the most powerful is Article 31, which talks about children's right to leisure, play, and culture. And it gives us the responsibility as those people who honour children's rights and educate children to respect and promote the right of the child to participate, and I love this next word, to participate fully in cultural and artistic life, and we shall encourage the provision of appropriate and equal opportunities for cultural, artistic, recreational, and leisure activity. So the notion of equity is really powerful in this human right. To give children their full right to cultural and artistic life, and to ask ourselves what should and could that look like in our community, in our pedagogy, in our relationships with children and families that we work with. I'll just draw attention to the beautiful image on the screen taken by my dear friend Joke Den Haas in Belgium during the pandemic. She does incredible projects connecting young children with the community, and this was connecting with some elderly people in an aged care home where the arts were the language of communication for these isolated elderly people and the young children who came into their community as citizens to elevate the right to access full cultural and artistic life. It's in my latest book, if anyone is keen to look at the big full page image of, it's one of my favourites in the book out of the 100 and something photos. It's definitely one of my favourites. So let's think about the benefits of early arts learning experiences. The research shows us that when we support children through visual arts learning experiences, we're creating rich opportunities for sensory exploration, inquiry, and relationship building. And all of that is integrating the social, emotional, cognitive dimensions of learning. We know that rich arts experiences elevate school readiness, particularly being of benefit to children who are impacted by inequity. So with all early intervention, we know that the biggest impacts are for those children who are most disadvantaged in our communities. Everyone benefits, of course, but the greatest benefit of early intervention is for children who might not have rich cultural and artistic experiences in their homes. We're supporting children to ask questions, to imagine possibilities, and to experiment with techniques. And when we do that, we're nurturing critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, and self-regulation skills, which, as we know from the research, the capacity to self-regulate is the number one predictor of success in our current schooling systems. So when we are able to enhance children's educational outcomes, we're providing children with the building of critical dispositions for lifelong learning. And in the green box, I've shown you some of those lifelong learning skills that we should never stop learning. And so if you're one of those people who doesn't consider themselves artistic or creative, if we believe children are capable of developing and fostering these dispositions, then why shouldn't we foster them for ourselves as we move throughout life? So we're fostering aesthetic learning, cognitive development, imagination and creativity, all the dispositions for learning like problem solving and critical thinking, creative thinking, persistence, trying even when something's hard, not giving up. They're dispositions that really equip children for success in their educational lives and throughout life, in their work lives as well. We're supporting social and relational learning. We're supporting emotional well-being, cultural identity, and also inclusion in a responsive, holistic curriculum environment. So there's a full chapter of that in my book, using all of the latest research literature to really empower us to have those conversations with families about why the arts should be centred in our curriculum, why they're important, and why we must honour those rights that children hold. But I'd also like to highlight the incredible benefits of visual arts pedagogies for educators. Because when we work in and through the arts, then we're gaining valuable insights into children's thinking and development. And then we can inform our teaching, our education strategies, and adapt those strategies to children's individual development and to their individual and personality preferences, their disposition preferences as well. When we work this way, we're deepening our understanding about how children are approaching problem solving And therefore, we're implementing more flexible and innovative curriculum approaches. And I'd also like to add, and this is me going off cuff again, if you compare a stencil activity, say where children are tracing dotted lines in order to develop their fine motor control, well, we can give that kind of an activity sheet to a child and we will learn whether they can stay on the line or not, and so will they, frankly. And that can sometimes be incredibly discouraging if we're asking children to do things which their development hasn't caught up to yet. Whereas if we give children an open-ended creative arts artisan process, such as weaving a ribbon in and out of a fence, or following our finger along some stitching on a beautiful piece of fabric, then that's going to tell us a whole lot more about children's problem solving, their dispositions, their critical thinking, their creativity, their persistence, than that little activity sheet is going to do. So we really can enrich the things we can learn about children if we simply just let them draw, for example, or if we give them a slab of clay and carefully observe what they do with it. So we're supporting children to build their relationships with those art materials and techniques. But what it also does is enriches our teaching and learning when we build our relationship with art materials and techniques. It broadens our repertoire for education and teaching. It gives us many, many hundreds more ideas for our curriculum planning when we have those resources at our disposal in terms of our pedagogical content knowledge, our domain knowledge, our knowledge of the arts, and the difference between art and craft, and some more knowledge about how we can bring those beautiful traditional artisan processes into our curriculum planning and into children's lives. And so working this way also enriches our opportunity to reflect on our own visual arts confidence and knowledge, and to extend our own professional growth and our own self-efficacy or confidence to implement arts experiences. And so it's not just about the benefits for children, but that we can be enriched in our work, in our profession, when we elevate things that we maybe are passionate about. So if you are a stitcher, or if you crochet, or if you are involved in carpentry, why not add that to children's lives? Or if you know some of the children's grandparents are involved with Men's Shed or with the local CWA or whatever it might be, you know a local artist, bring them in, or an artisan or a crafter, bring them into your service and involve them. Draw upon them for resources that you can use with the children that you work with, and therefore connect children to the very communities and cultures that surround them. So let's now think about, we've got about an hour to go, so I'm very mindful of not dragging my chain and making sure we keep up. We've got a fabulous video to listen to in a few more minutes. Children always are learning, okay? So as I said earlier, no matter what we offer to children, they will learn. But quality learning is determined by the quality of the pedagogy that children experience, the quality of the relationships we present as co-learners, co-researchers and partners in the learning experience, but also our curation of the materials and the curriculum that we offer to children. So Farquhar says quality teaching is defined as pedagogical practices that facilitate for diverse children their access to knowledge, activities and opportunities to advance their skills in ways that build on previous learning, just what Dewey was saying, and assist in learning how to learn, and to provide that strong foundation for further learning in relation to all of the goals we might have around curriculum design and development and the aims we have for children. Now, I want to jump across now to think about that notion of craft. Right? When people talk about doing art and craft, often people are using that term to apply to teacher-led or adult-led activities. This was from a post that I actually saw on a Facebook group that I'm in. I think from the language, it's one that's based in the US. And so people were saying things like, y'all need to do this. It's hysterical. And other people saying, kids like to see conventionally accepted design success too. These can build confidence and provide ideas for students to build upon. Somebody else loved them. The difference between between these paper sharks, give them such individual personalities. And then somebody else doing what somebody else always does is justifies it on teaching fine motor control. Animal anatomy? Mm, okay, if you say so. Maybe you're learning a bit of balance, and then they were defending their love of this more structured, adult-directed craftivity by saying, well, not every art project needs to be free flow. I would actually say that if we're honouring the children's rights all the time, then we would always question something that takes children's agency away from them, even if it's just once every now and then and won't corrupt their natural development. But we need to ask ourselves these critical questions. We need to be reflective educators. It's one of the core principles of our early years learning framework to be a critical reflector. Whereas there were a handful of people who challenged this shark craftivity, and I'm calling it a craftivity, not a craptivity. I'm going to put a little aside here. You will have heard people call this kind of experience a craptivity in a fairly derogatory way. I don't agree with doing that, because an educator who makes the choice to do an adult controlled structured activity is only doing so because they either haven't been challenged to think differently, it might have been the way they were taught, perhaps it makes them feel safe and comfortable to have a template to follow because they don't feel confident. And the minute we ridicule a colleague for their choices, for their curriculum knowledge, it's not going to help them to change their mind to do what will honour children's rights. In my experience, if we call something like this a craptivity, then the person who designed it will dig their heels in and they will refuse to change. They'll give all of the excuses in the green box till the day they die because they have to uphold their own confidence and identity. They don't want to feel ridiculed and squashed by their colleagues. So I'd rather speak respectfully about every choice, because everyone is only doing the best they can with the knowledge they've developed to that point in time. Hopefully, coming to training like this, maybe it makes some of you feel uncomfortable. Maybe for some of you, it's very encouraging. But wherever it lands with you, think deeply about it and what it means in terms of children's rights, the little e end versus the big E end of the continuum. And so I was encouraged when the people in the pink box were actually saying, hey, this looks like product art where child development tells us to focus on process. Somebody else said, yeah, it's teacher directed, better to give the children a material and let them design the idea. That teaches problem solving skills and creativity. Written by a kid that fought this so-called art her whole life. So this was somebody who'd done this kind of structured thing as a child and it hadn't helped them to develop confidence. So let's think about how we can empower children to truly speak with the 100 languages that is their human right. And so if we're defining the difference between visual arts learning, craft activities, and then what we're talking about tonight, traditional crafts and artisan work, then we can really define a visual arts learning experience as being focused on exploration, discovery, meaning making, communication, expression, and developing some skills. A craft activity, the focus of that is the creation of a product generally. It can be just about skills development. It can certainly be fun and busy work and step by step. Whereas traditional crafts and artisan work is drawing upon our cultural heritage. It's thinking about a product still. It's still thinking about skills development. It's still fun, and there are still step-by-step processes. So sometimes it's a little hard to distinguish between them. The source of direction is helpful. So in visual arts learning, the source of direction should be child-led, sometimes requires adult contributions and support. Whereas a craft activity in that traditional adult-led activity sort of domain is an adult-led adaptation of an artisan skill to complete a product. So, for example, if you're making those paper sharks on the previous slide, then there's scissor skills, there's gluing skills. They're all traditional crafting processes, right? But they're being framed within a contained sort of outcome. Whereas if we're saying the source of direction for traditional crafts and artisan work, we're thinking about it being informed by culture and heritage, still requires some instruction of techniques. But then we're leaving the outcome up to the children, and that's where I'd like to make the distinction. So a visual arts learning outcome is unique, varied. It's an expression of children's visual arts languages development. The craft activity, the outcome is uniform. The variations are pretty surface level. You know, with those sharks, somebody said they could see the personality differences. I didn't see a lot of difference because pretty much the children were having to position the right bits in the right places according to that educator so that they would learn about the anatomy of a shark. Dubious claim there. Whereas traditional crafts and artisan work, the outcome, I would like to say, is not the product, but it's the play and the transmission of artisan cultural traditions, and an open-ended application of traditional artisan processes and materials can actually fall into the visual arts category. It can be artistic if we leave the outcome and the play with those materials in the hands of children. And you'll see some examples of that shortly. Now, Dewey, my mate, he talked about the idea that not all experiences are equal. He said some learning experiences or activities are miseducative and can actually hinder children's current and future learning. And I've put a couple of examples there of using children's body parts for printmaking. Dewey said, the belief that all genuine education comes about through experience doesn't mean that all experiences are genuinely or equally educative. He said experience and education cannot be directly equated to each other because some experiences are miseducative. And then he explains that further and says, any experience is miseducative, or the opposite of education, when it has the effect of arresting or distorting the growth of further experience. And when we tell children that the thing they're making has to look a certain way, then we are distorting the growth of further experience because we're telling children that the adult way of doing things and following their adult instructions is the right thing to do. And to do your own thing would be considered a little bit revolutionary. John Dewey proposed that a child's innate impulse, that right we were talking about, to make and communicate meaning using aesthetic materials, so materials of interest and beauty, and to reproduce ideas graphically, integrates play, aesthetic awareness, communication, and cognition. So it's that whole child learning that we were talking about when we were listing all of the benefits of centering the arts across your curriculum planning. And this aligns really powerfully, right, with those of you who are familiar with the Reggio Emilia approach to art and pedagogy. That's kind of how they're positioning the arts too, that it's not about the art product, but it's about the learning that is happening in this interrelationship with materials, in partnership and in relationship with adults who are co-learners, co-researchers, co-inquirers along with children. Dewey said art gives an education which actually educates. Fancy that art is a tool for making meaning through play, where we're ensuring authentic materials and processes are offered, or if we don't use authentic materials and processes, he said we risk either physical and emotional excitement. So it's all very entertaining, but there's not a lot of education. There's a deadening of power. He said, connect knowing and doing through hands-on activity, learning and inquiry. And he even said, work out the intellectual possibilities within arts crafts. And by that, he meant artisan processes, those traditional crafts, and occupations, as he called them, the everyday life skills, you know, such as sewing on a button, those skills that we hope every adult has capacity for as they go out into the world. And he told us in 1910 to reorganise the curriculum accordingly, to link those home cultural traditions into the education system. And that's what really got me thinking about how the fact that people were determined to not do adult controlled step-by-step activities, but as often happens in early childhood, when one thing is thrown away, you know, the stencils and the colouring in sheets and the structured shark making, when educators decided to throw that away, they also threw away the stitching, the weaving, the carpentry, the clay, because they were worried about the adult instruction being central, when it's actually the adult just simply being a rich resource for children when we teach them skills and processes. So art and artisan work as experience. Dewey's, one of his major publications is called Art as Experience. And in my thesis, I pinched his title a little bit and used the words art is experience for educators and for children. So art shouldn't merely be an object to be admired, but it's a dynamic experience that arises from that relationship between the creator, the object, and the viewer. And so artwork, artifacts, the products of children work are too often not valued enough, in my opinion. So that's why I say it's the process and the product. And Dewey reminded us that we shouldn't be putting, you know, the fine art, the stuff that's in the Archibald Prize, although some people question whether it's fine art. But there's no point separating art into low and high, fine art and useful art. He said cultural artefacts, including those made by artisans, can be vehicles for shared meaning making that are capable of fostering empathy and dialogue, as well as connecting community, family, and all in and through democratic engagement. So, are traditional crafts actually art? In a determination, as I said, not to deliver the adult controlled step-by-step processes, such as stitching, threading, weaving, paper crafts, etc., which have all seemed to disappear largely from early childhood services. And yet all art involves skills, processes and techniques. Now, children are capable holders of rights. They have the right to meet and be immersed in crafting and artisan processes and to connect with the cultural traditions of their community. And part of our role then is to deconstruct those artisan and crafting processes, those traditional crafting cultural traditions, to support children to meet materials, no matter what their age, no matter what their stage of development. So some of you might be looking at this and saying, oh, that's all well and good because a preschooler can learn how to weave, but a baby can't. Correct, the baby isn't at the point of weaving yet, but they can meet fabric. They can play with strips of natural and man-made materials. They can poke things in and out of a fence, right? So we can actually teach the language, the vocabulary of the artisan and traditional crafting processes when we deconstruct the elements of that process. The stages of learning that happen for an older child can be introduced as multiple meetings with materials, no matter children's age and stage. And I'll unpack that a little bit more later. So let's now think about that idea of traditional and artisan crafts being a way that we can demonstrate cultural respect and connection. In our latest book, we identified that when we connect visual arts learning experiences with cultural events and festivals and then make that leap into the cultural and artisan traditions associated with them, then we're opening up that dialogue, that awareness, those opportunities to maintain cultural traditions and collective memory. So, you know, you've got, as I said, the notion of weaving. I've stuck a photo there of the beautiful lanterns that we came across all the time when we were in Vietnam. Working with clay from a young age is a way of connecting to one of the most ancient artisan processes on the planet. My colleagues in Vietnam, also around Tet Festival, support the children to engage in the traditional knowledges of kite and lamp building, not the not the dreadful Chinese lanterns we all did at school, which is the snip, snip, snip across a folded piece of red paper where we then, manipulate it into the squeezy red lantern, which has nothing to do with a traditional artisan process, right? That's a craft that's been adapted from the notion of genuine creative artisan processes. And so that's why we really want to stop and think about how can we connect local cultural expertise and knowledge and traditions into our curriculum, and we can do it by deconstructing artisan processes and techniques and materials and support children to have meetings with those materials when they're very young, some of the steps in the process as they develop, and then pulling that all together once their cognitive development and physical capacities are all working in alignment. So, to unpack that, I'm actually about to share with you, and I hope the audio works really well. But I know Family Daycare have put this up on YouTube as well, so you should be able to access it again after this webinar, I hope, to really listen to it and unpack it. Now, ideally, as you know, in these webinars, we generally are asking for a Family Daycare interviewee. We didn't get one for this, and I was curious about why. Perhaps because a little bit of ambiguity around what we were going to be discussing. So I called on my friend Mel Elderton, a dear colleague who works at Explore and Develop Annandale, and she unpacks their practice for us. So let's listen to that while I have a bit of a drink, and we'll come back and wrap up all of the different possibilities for you in your practice. Hi everyone, I'm really pleased to introduce you to Mel Elderton, who is the educational leader at Explore and Develop Annandale. And I'm really aware of the work there through several connections, but particularly impressed by their work around including artisan and crafting processes for young children, right from the babies on upwards.
Well, really, we were looking at what are the strengths of our teachers, and what do they enjoy doing, and how could we bring some of that joy into their work with children. We have a lot of crocheters and knitters here with us, so that became something that we were working with textile art, and sewing was something that people enjoyed doing outside of school, and something that we thought would be fun to bring in. And using that strength-based lens for teaching, it makes the teachers engaged and happy to come and passionate to share what they're passionate about. So that's really how it started.
So that's really similar for me because in my own teaching, I used to take the sewing machine in because I was a bit of a quilter, still am, loving the colour and putting fibre and fabric together. And children really respond to that. And more often than used to be the case, children are not necessarily seeing these artisan processes in their home life. And so it started to dawn on me as I was doing my research and reading the work of John Dewey particularly, that embedding children in the occupations of their own culture is part of our responsibility to keep certain arts and crafts alive culturally, but also to offer them to children as a language that they respond to really readily. And my work sort of showed that the crafting processes have disappeared a lot from the early childhood space because people are worried about it being guided by an adult or modelled by an adult. And yet,
Yeah.
the idea of centering our work around things we're passionate about makes sense, right? We bring expertise and joy to the process. Anyway.
Well, they're sharp and pointy, the tools that we use for those things. And I think, core to our philosophy is the idea of trust with children. And I think we always hear a lot of people spouting, oh, children are so capable, blah 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 blah.
And
Yet
yeah,
they're afraid to give them needles because they might prick their finger. And I think so. If we're trusting that children are capable, we're trusting that we can have conversations with them, that this is a dangerous tool. And if you prick your finger, it's going to hurt. Do you want to do this experience?
Mm.
Um, and I think, the same with the sewing machine, we have those conversations around it. We've got our risk assessments in place, and we also have strategies where, the teacher, there's rules. The teacher
Mm.
needs to be
Life
with
has
you,
rules, right? Yeah.
right? When you're doing this
Technique
experience.
requires knowledge. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. So what we're telling children when we're trusting them with these sharp tools is that I believe that you can do this, and that is
Mm.
such a powerful thing for young children.
That makes me think about how children are so responsive when you put authentic tools and materials in their hands too. We often think children are not ready, children need to be older to do this, etc., etc. And yet they are so responsive when they're given the trust, the agency, as you were saying before, to manage those tools or to learn to manage them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Mm.
I think seeing children sitting around just embroidering and chatting to each other, and they're such little children, but they're so confident.
Yeah.
Seeing a 4-year-old just not even looking at what she's doing, but and having a chat over here with a friend as her hand
Yeah,
is
beautiful.
moving is
Yeah,
just
yeah.
beautiful because she's been doing it since she was 2.
Yeah. And with that, I was going to ask a question about that. So with your youngest children or the youngest citizens in your
Mm.
service, the under threes, how do you introduce those crafting methods, materials when you're not
Yeah.
necessarily ready to teach them the under over technique of a needle and thread, for example?
Yeah, I think because these things are always happening in our environment, and we do have quite an
Mm,
open environment, and the children, we call them free range,
yeah, yeah,
can
yeah.
can go in and out wherever they like. They're often, they're watching what their older peers are doing, and they want to be involved. So, we do provide opportunities for them just to play with
Yeah,
needle and thread.
yeah.
So we'll give them a hoop, and we'll use some more like a Hessian type
Mm,
fabric where,
mm, mm.
it's a bit more holy for the
Yeah,
needle
yeah.
to go in
Beautifully
easy.
holding. Yeah.
And we'll talk about the process. So,
Mm.
we usually will draw with tailor's chalk our design,
Oh, sure.
and then we go with the threads.
I encourage similar thinking, that when you're 2 or even younger, you can actually be learning the language of sewing through physical movement games, playing games that have the over
Oh, the
and the
over and
under,
under.
right? So
Yeah.
it's not even necessarily having to be directly connected to the process of sewing, but that it can be that conceptual knowledge of the movement, that initial meeting with the materials, even, that idea of let's just meet a basket of wool, let's just meet the
Let's just
thread.
eat a pile of fabric.
Yeah,
And
let's wrap. I know we've talked about how some children really delight in re-wrapping the
yeah.
threads around the little cardboard
Yep.
holder. All of that is the
Yep.
language of sewing, and meeting the fabrics, the different kinds of fabrics, and so on. So, yeah, I'd really encourage those listening to this video to think about how you can deconstruct a process to create those multiple meetings with not just the materials, but the tools, the processes, the actions that you take, to sort of break it into its component parts.
Because of the way we teach it with a process,
Mm,
because it
mm,
is a process,
mm,
you find your material, you find your hoop,
mm, mm,
you draw out your design, and then you pick your thread, and then you work.
mm,
That
mm.
that step-by-step process, I think, slows the child down naturally,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and that slowing down supports them to think through what they want to do. So the design becomes important, um and it's really interesting to see how different their their art is when through these processes because, and how it influences when they approach other materials.
Yeah, yeah. So that willingness to slow down, that focus, maybe that idea that you're not necessarily doing an arts experience from beginning to end in one sitting. I think that's something that's really rich in working this
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, these projects, particularly the stitching projects.
Mm,
I know our preschoolers, we have a tradition. They sew themselves with the sewing machine a boomerang bag, so basically a
mm,
tote.
mm.
Um, and then they embroider the pockets
Yeah,
with their
yeah.
designs and their name and
Right.
personalize them. And they start that 6 months before the end
Mm,
of the year. So
mm, mm.
they're working on that one bag and that one piece of embroidery for months, and
Yeah,
they might put
across
it down.
multiple sittings. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, they'll put
yeah.
it down and not look at it for weeks,
Mm,
and
mm.
then go back to it. So
And I think what's rich in that is the educators also slowing down and just embracing those one-on-one moments or those one adult to a couple of children where you're providing that scaffolding and that support, providing the solutions to problems if the child can't
mm,
overcome that themselves and really taking those rhythms of the child into account in the offering. I think that's important too, that we don't have to be in a hurry all the time with these kinds of opportunities for children's engagement and learning.
yeah. So I guess there's multiple ways we do it. I guess the first way is that kind of that compliance aspect.
Mm,
Let's just get
mm.
that out of the way first.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We've got risk assessments for dangerous tools. It is
Mm.
a holistic risk assessment. We have dangerous tools, and this may include sewing
Right,
machines,
right, right.
drills, sanders, needles, hot glue guns,
Mm, mm. Whatever it may
whatever,
be. Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
whatever we can think of. Um,
Mhm.
so that is reviewed regularly by leadership, but also by the team. Then we've got procedures. For example, for the woodworking area, you always must be with a teacher. You must
Mhm.
have your PPE on.
Yep, yep.
Um, so we've got, children's
The
goggles,
goggles.
gloves,
Yeah.
earmuffs if we're working with power tools. Um, so all of those things are there. And the children have helped us over the years, and we keep remaking them so they're relevant to that group of children. So they've made the procedure. So they've made a visual procedure
Yeah.
of how to
Mm,
set up the
mm,
space and what safety precautions we need to have for
mm.
that.
Nice.
So having those three steps, I think the the compliance aspect, the
Mm, mm.
policy, then the risk assessment, the procedures, but then also the children's procedure
Input.
is really important, I think, for making sure that everyone is safe, most
Mm, mm,
importantly,
mm.
but also for making sure that the children feel in charge of that process as well.
Nice.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
quite often you'll hear the children reminding the adult,
Yeah.
"You can't
Yeah.
come here, you don't have your goggles on."
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So that it's a mutually beneficial space, but everyone has responsibility for remembering the rules of the space that
Yeah.
keep us all safe. And I guess what that's doing, I think, is honouring children's rights to engage as citizens in their space, but also to have the freedom to explore, but within those boundaries. It's not doing away with safety, it's actually centering safety,
Mm.
but not letting that be the barrier to children having these kinds of experiences where they are empowered, where their agency is elevated. So it's sort of cyclical back to what we discussed at the very beginning about children's rights and agency as well.
But I think both things can exist. I think the product, as long as the product is something that is in the child's hands, there's opportunity to play with the materials.
Mm,
So
mm.
playing with fabric, playing with string, or playing with wool, when we're talking about fiber art is really, really important.
Yeah.
But then
Because
the
you're
other
learning the properties of that material. Yeah.
completely, right? Building a relationship with that
Mm,
material
mm,
is
mm.
is super important. but then there's also a beautiful opportunity to teach elements of design
Mm.
and technique and the skills that are involved with being able to work with those materials. So in terms of building curriculum, I guess, there's this, if we go like just focus in on the fiber arts stuff, there is a goal in
Mm.
particular with the boomerang bag, like with their
Yeah,
with their personal bags that they make, because it's a bag and it's got an
mm.
embroidered pocket. Like
Yeah,
that's
there's
it. That
stuff to
is
do.
that is what they make,
Mm,
right?
mm,
But they have agency in how it's designed,
mm,
and
mm.
giving them the space and the tools and the techniques and the skills
Yeah.
to break down that design process is really empowering for the child. And that's where I guess that curriculum building around it comes involved, because it does become a process of, right,
Mm.
let's learn this technique. The more we give them these skills and the more we teach them about this stuff, the more amazing
Mm.
work they produce on their own.
Yes, that's right.
Because
Yeah.
there comes a point where we don't need to show them how to set up the hoop and
Mm,
how to
mm.
work with
They've got
with
that
tailor's
skill.
chalk.
Yeah,
They've
yeah,
got it. They just
yeah.
they just go about that. They draw
Mm.
their design and they'll go and select their own
Yeah.
thread. They've learnt how to thread the needle.
Mm, mm.
Um, and they get on with their work.
Well, thank you, Mel. I think this conversation will hopefully plant some seeds of reflection for the people listening and hopefully encourage them to, one, elevate the artisan and crafting processes they might love to do themselves, and to introduce that to the children that they live and work with and educate. So thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome.
Yes, something I would add around artisan processes is that when we're drawing upon the cultural work of traditional custodians of the land, we need to be aware of habits and assumptions. So we want to provoke, rather than imitating an artist's work or appropriation of traditional Aboriginal works, beware of our own habits and assumptions. So with Aboriginal artwork, for example, dot painting is not the only form of Aboriginal painting. In fact, it was really only started in about the 1970s, once acrylic paints became more accessible. Traditionally, cross-hatching is much more of a traditional artisan process for Indigenous people in Australia. So let's do our own research as well, learn from what's available online and in galleries to really shift and extend our own thinking around traditional and artisan processes as well. I just wanted to add that in really carefully there. So let's think about the difference between a step-by-step predetermined outcome when it comes to a craft activity where the child is not necessarily having their ideas elevated, versus art, which is open-ended, where the outcome is determined by the art maker. But I'd also like to suggest that those same definitions, where crafting processes that have an artisan underpinning, a cultural knowledge underpinning, such as the stitching you saw with Mel talking about what they do at Explore and Develop Annandale, there are still the benefits of learning a step-by-step process, and there is somewhat of a predetermined outcome. However, the product is expressing the voice of the child in an artistic way, in an open-ended way, because the child was involved in the design. And then we can also blur the lines. So crafting can become art, and art can actually employ crafting techniques. So the weaving that you see on the right-hand side using sticks and natural materials, I believe, is a beautiful piece of art, which really is that child voice and experience and engagement with materials that can really speak very powerfully around the rights of the child and the capabilities of the child. So both types of experience can potentially support children's learning and engagement, but the difference between them can be a bit like the difference between a closed and an open-ended question. So if we think back to the shark, and while I know I was a bit disparaging toward people who choose the shark, the reason I choose not to be disparaging about the person. I won't say what they're doing is a craptivity or belittle them as an educator, but I will question the choice. I will question the choice of the experiences that we offer because I believe children have a right for their voice to be heard, for their theories about shark, their knowledge of shark, as an example, to be expressed through their making rather than being contained into the idea of an adult and having to follow the instructions and the control of an adult. So that's the distinction that I'd really like us to think about deeply. So I want to jump fairly quickly through these next slides so that if there are any questions, we can address them. And maybe there'll be more questions than there is time. And I'm happy for people to reach out to me on my Facebook page if you have, and Messenger and so on, if you want to follow up. But when we're thinking about traditional crafts and artisan techniques, the kinds of things we can explore are stitching, threading, weaving, origami, paper folding techniques, quilling, which is also a traditional paper craft, finger knitting, clay work, woodwork, just to name a few, and you might think of others. But let's run through how we might deconstruct an artisan process. We've been talking about that throughout this webinar, that it's not just about what the 3 to 5-year-olds can do. It's about thinking, how do we introduce meetings with materials and processes for every child that we work with? So we deconstruct the process and adapt it to the children's prior experience. So if it's their first meeting with materials, whether they're a baby or whether they've had little experience with materials as a 4-year-old, then we want to break it down to introduce each of the materials and tools that come together to form an art process. And so we can deconstruct the way we work instead of getting stuck into thinking everything must be a complex step-by-step process where the adult's hands, heart, and mind are forced to take over because the child is just at the meeting with materials stage of development. So let's make sure we honour the rights of children by creating those entry points for them into the meetings with materials, the meetings with the tools, and the meetings with the techniques. They can all be separate learning experiences repeated over time. And so if we're thinking about sewing and threading, we can create meetings with hessian and fabric. We can thread large beads onto pipe cleaners or thick thread. We can poke ribbons through a mesh screen or a fence. We can post paddle pop sticks into a post box. And as I said in the video, we can learn the language of sewing by playing over and under games. Or in our physical obstacle courses, we can be talking the language of going over and under and over and under, which is what the needle does in the threading process. Introducing sewing machines and tools should be part of children's cultural heritage, and they are capable. I have used sewing machines. I've seen it happening so powerfully with Mel and the educators at Explore and Develop, and Mother Dark up in Queensland, and in numerous, I'm sure, numerous family daycare homes, there are sewing machines. Now, as Mel said, definitely be thinking through your risk assessment. Make sure that part of learning these skills and techniques is also learning the boundaries and the precautions that we must take. But it can children respond to complexity in my work and experience. And when we simplify things and dumb them down and give them children versions of materials instead of the authentic materials, then we're doing them a disservice, because this used to be part of every child's cultural heritage when people in the home used machines and stitching and threading, but these languages are being lost in our busy modern society, and I think we should be bringing these languages back into the repertoire. If we think about fibre arts, how could we deconstruct knitting to be meetings with wool, to be tangling wool, to be snipping wool, to do knitting, crochet, felting, textile explorations, fashion design, the good old finger knitting on a tube and so on. And there are videos online where showing you how you can teach crochet to very young children. So there's lots of potential with the fibre arts that are overlooked often. Weaving, so whether that's with fabrics or natural materials, in the top image on the top right, my friend Catherine Lee, who used to be the director at the Point Preschool in Sydney, they collected plastic bags and then wove strips of plastic bags into matting that was donated to the homeless. So, going from paper weaving all the way through to fabric weaving and so on and so forth. Paper crafts, origami, paper folding, and quilling. If you're not sure what quilling is, we don't have time to go into the detail, but on the screen you can see swirls of paper. That blue implement in the middle of the screen is a quilling tool. I'm pointing at it. I don't know if you can see my pointer. Children adore the complexity of quilling, so look it up online and you can buy the tools quite cheaply to add to your repertoire. Modelling and introducing these new skills, motivating children to master techniques, and they're very motivated to master techniques. Deconstructing these experiences for material meetings with younger children, introducing the tools of paper such as hole punches and staplers and scissors and sticky tape and so on. Clay, we're thinking about air dry versus ceramic versus paper clay. My personal favourite is ceramic clay, which you can store for well over a year and reuse and repurpose. You don't have to let it dry out. Air dry clay and paper clay tend to dry out very, very quickly, and people get frustrated with it. So our book unpacks how to look after clay, how to store it, and I think I've got some stuff on my website as well. So if not, reach out and ask me. But it's a beautiful natural material. It has connection to the earth. As I said before, it's the most ancient of art materials. It's tactile and responsive, really empowering for children. Much more, let me just say this, Play-Doh, it's an important resource, but it's no substitute for clay. Clay is an artisan material. Clay is a manipulative material. Carpentry and woodwork, I can't speak highly enough of the empowerment that comes with these complex skills and techniques, purposeful occupation, problem solving, all of the science, technology, engineering, and math, and that embodied hard work, responsive material engagement that says to the child, you matter, I trust you, you're capable. Sorry, I'm just trying to make it click to the next one. There we go. So artisan traditions and crafts introduce children to so many life skills, and as I said, many of them are already being lost in our family and community contexts. So when we take the time to immerse children in traditional craft and artisan methods, we're fostering so many benefits, including the capacity for sustained effort, concentration, attention to detail, problem solving, experimentation, resourcefulness, patience and perseverance in spite of challenge, so really building a growth mindset, purposeful development of fine motor skills and hand-eye coordination, skills that are grounded in cultural and traditional history rather than being a teacher-produced activity sheet. So much more meaningful for the child. To appreciate cultural artistic expression, to use the language and the new terminology around these processes, to collaborate with other people as we're learning these skills, and also to elevate and reuse and recycle sustainable materials rather than using lots of disposable, commercially made materials. So I'd like to encourage you to reignite your artisan self. Share your own cultural and artisan skills. Learn skills from elders and artisans and crafters in your community, or invite families and elders into your classroom or your family daycare setting to demonstrate and share their cultural and artisan skill knowledge and skills. Be intentional and enrich children's engagement and arty play. I loved this quote: by doing what you love, you can inspire and awaken the hearts of others. And I'm just going to quickly play this little video that was taken at Northern Nursery with Auntie Carleen Green, teaching some of my Vietnamese colleagues how to weave in traditional artisan weaving processes.
For years. So when we do with the natural fibres, we use that lovely grass like just here. It's called it's called lamanta grass. So when we put this on, then we just put it in here, and then we've got to pull that all the way through. See? That comes through, and this here will, there you go.
That's all there is, but I just thought that was worth listening to, the sharing of cultural knowledge. And just to finish, I'm going to play just part of a poem that I've written. You can read the whole poem if you're interested on my blog. It's one of my older blogs, but they're all on my website. And it's called A Blueprint for Beauty, the whole poem. But this excerpt, I think, speaks to honouring children's rights. Possibilities, an excerpt from Blueprint for Beauty. Let us create an educational project that gives credit to children, that makes them known, that makes them visible. Let us support children to witness their presence. Let us hand children the tools that will support them to build their own worlds, create their own wonder, express their own understandings and reject imposed plans. Let us, with children, design blueprints for beauty that will support our shared journey of life. Let us embrace the possible and live and move between rules and exceptions, for that is the place of miracles, the heart of beauty. Now, before we jump to questions, I'm just going to share that screen with you. If anyone does want to go on my mailing list to hear about the intercultural opportunities or future training opportunities, you can QR code scan that QR code, take a scan of that, and that'll take you onto my mailing list. And that way I can share information with you. Probably out of all those on the screen, the one at the bottom, my website, is probably the one that connects you to all of the other contact points that I have. But to finish, I'm open for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that we can potentially, I can bring your chat across where I can see it. And if there are any questions, please feel free to type them. Otherwise, I will hope to see you another time. I know I am going to be presenting at the New South Wales Family Daycare Conference in Sydney in October. But otherwise, reach out if you have questions or suggestions. Or if you really disagreed with anything I've said, I'm always happy to have a discussion and compare notes about how we think about these things, because there's no one right way to work with children. It is a continuum of experience, but I'd really encourage you to think more and more about how you can work toward that big E end of the continuum. So thanks, everybody. I don't see any questions there. Let me just quickly check. I'll stay online until past anyway, just in case there are any questions. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks for your participation. Thanks to those of you who shared some really great perspectives as well in the comments. I really appreciated that. Alrighty. Somebody has said, oops, I've gone back. So Meredith has said she finds risk assessments very hard to do. And maybe that's one for family daycare to think about. Let's have some thinking about how to conduct a risk assessment. Really good point. Oh, there's a lot more. Thanks for your thanks, everybody. I really appreciate the feedback. I'm keeping an eye out in case there are any questions. You have a good night too, Pooja Singh. Thank you. Just call me Gai. No need to call me Dr. Gai, although it's kind of catchy. That's why I went with the name. My dear friend Mukunda in Kathmandu calls me Dr. Gai, so it's sort of stuck. Lots of thanks there. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for coming. It was a really well-attended webinar. Thanks, Helen. I appreciate your feedback. Good night, everybody. Ooh, getting messy. Oh, I'm already seeing people filling out the contact form, so that's great. I will send you some information tomorrow about the trip to Nepal that's happening in December. Although I know December's a shocking time, but that's when it has to happen this year due to some glitches that happened earlier in the year for Kathmandu. Glad you enjoyed the information, Angel. Thanks for your feedback. Thanks, Luma. Thanks, Fazana. Have a good night, everyone. You've had a long day, so make the most of having some downtime before your day begins again tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. No questions jumping up. Great, Jody. Yes, I will jump on and have a look at the QR form tomorrow. I'm going to also stop as soon as we finish this evening because, like you, I've been going since the crack of dawn. Okay, it looks like everyone's heading on out. I'll leave it to Ethan to end the webinar. Ah, there's a question. Where can I get traditional materials? That's a really good question. EJ, I would talk to local artisans and crafters about where they source particular materials. I guess it depends on the art form that you're planning on implementing. But for example, with the raffia, I got onto a source through one of my Aboriginal colleagues here in the Shoalhaven. So you can ask local artisans and artists is probably the best way to connect. If you're thinking about getting into carpentry, then as we explain in our book, connecting with local carpenters or woodworkers, they will often, or a local sawmill, will be happy to provide offcuts for you to use. And I can also encourage you to look at the work of my dear friend Pete Morehouse on his website. We share some of that in our book, but he has a website full of information about carpentry with young children. And yes, Amar, you may exit. There's no need to stay on board if you've got things to do. Sharon, you're in the Shoalhaven. Yeah, I'm in the centre of Nowra. So feel free to reach out to me on Facebook. Maybe we could have a coffee someday. Any go-to resources I'd recommend for families to help educate on artisan arts? Well, I'll plug my book. There's a lot in there about connecting to community and connecting to local artists and artisans. Some of what I presented tonight is around all of the benefits of working that way. So hopefully you were taking some notes, but if not, most of what I drew upon is in the book, which I did put up on that last slide. It's available through Routledge, Amazon, a heap of booksellers. If you just search for my name and the name of the book, Art, Play and Inquiry, you will find it online. Thanks, Zainab. I appreciate your feedback. So yeah, talk to local artists, go to your local gallery, make connections. That's really the most powerful way to build your own connections to resources, but also to people, human resources, the people in your community. Men's Shed is another great place to make a connection with local clay societies and what's the word I'm looking for? Ceramics studios. They will give you lots of advice about where they source their clay. I would avoid the educational supply catalogues. They tend to sell a lot of fairly cheap and nasty stuff from that's maybe not sustainably sourced or produced from overseas. So try and go local as much as you can. But having said that, I also get lots of stuff at Spotlight myself because, you know, the number of craft stores in the country has kind of dwindled a fair bit compared to what it used to be. Thanks, Hong Lin. I appreciate it. Lovely to get your feedback, and thanks for enjoying the webinar. I will look forward to connecting with you. If you ever do connect with me, tell me that this is that you are in this webinar. It'll help me make the connection to your context. Yeah, I agree, Sukyong Yusiao. I hope I said your name correctly. there are restrictions sometimes for family daycare educators, but I'd also like to challenge you to think about where you potentially have freedoms because of your smaller number of children, because of the fact that it's in your home, that you can connect children to your own cultural and artisan knowledges and materials. And children can meet materials at any stage and age. You don't have to wait until they are developmentally capable of putting all of the steps in a process together. In fact, I would say you empower them more when you introduce them to materials from the very beginning. Anyway, we've hit 8:30, so have a great evening, everyone, and enjoy your artisan and cultural traditional arts play. I'll look forward to hearing what you do. Okay, thanks.
Thanks for participating in this episode of PD in Your Pocket. This series was produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal peoples. If you'd like to watch or listen to other episodes in this series, or find out more information about this program, you can find us at our website at nswfdc.org.au/PD in Your Pocket.